So today I'm going to talk about anger as a portal to unconditioned, authentic, absolute strength. So normally, anger is much like hatred as a reaction, can be an emotion that people have. In the Buddhist world, unfortunately, anger and hatred are one of the or two of the areas where spiritual bypass is most commonly employed. I can't tell you how many times I've heard people who identify as Buddhists, whether they're students or teachers, say to me, "Oh, I don't get angry. I don't have any hatred." And I don't believe it. It's not accurate. If you're a human in the world, you're going to be triggered by events in the world. And it's not the triggering that's the issue. Having hatred or anger arise isn't the issue. It's how do we relate to it? And if we're trying to suppress it or bury it or disown it in some way, we're rejecting what's actually here. And hatred and anger, I'll talk about hatred, I think, next month. But anger is a particular kind of reaction that we have. And it's more important what we do when anger arises than keeping anger suppressed. That's really not a helpful way to be. I don't typically like to use the word enlightenment because it has so much embedded meaning to so many people. But if I were to say what enlightened behavior is, it's the ability to be with whatever is arising in the moment, whatever is arising. So it's not preferencing, I only want bliss, happiness, and hugs. I'm going to be with whatever rises in awareness. This is what the practice is. And then we're with whatever's here. If anger arises, anger can be a really juicy topic to work. We can have a lot of history around it. We can have a lot of judgment about it. So it really gets to be a pretty rich topic or territory. And so, as I mentioned, the Buddhist world, there's really a kind of a cultural idealization that we don't have anger. And you see, I've seen movies or documentaries on Buddhism, and they'll show, for example, Buddhists in Thailand. And, the Thai, as a general rule, are a very sweet, peaceful group. If you know the Enneagram, it's believed that Thailand is a 9 on the Enneagram, which is the Ennea type of harmonization, of getting along, of smoothing things out, of everybody, working together. And that's really how Thailand is. If you look at the overall generalization, that's how Thailand presents. And that's how Buddhists like to hold that we all are. And of course, it's not accurate, but it is a cultural belief. So typically, whenever we feel minimized, ignored, rejected, those kinds of qualities, we can feel the pain that causes. In addition to the pain, what it triggers is fear and anxiety and hurt, because we become afraid of whatever was the seeming cause of the anger. For example, if you're driving and somebody dangerously cuts you off, the initial reaction, if you're tracking, is going to be some type of fear of your own injury or another's injury or death could be possible. So it triggers that fight or flight response, typically fight, flight, or freeze response. And for many of us, when we feel that fear, we don't want to be with the fear. And so we turn to anger, we lash out at the other. This is how the road rage incidents happen. Many years ago, maybe 15 years ago, I was living in the Bay Area, and there was this article online or in the newspaper about two elderly men who had gotten into a road rage incident, and one of them had cut off the other. And so they began following each other, honking and yelling and gesturing. And one of the men ended up following the other one all the way to his house. The man who was being followed pulled into his garage, shut the garage, went in the house. The other guy came, was banging on the doors, screaming and yelling in anger. And the first man whose house it was came out and shot the other man dead. And it turned out they were both very senior doctors in the Bay Area. So educated people, and you would think would have better control over their emotions, but they led to where one died and the other one was going to prison for the rest of his life. And this was all because of anger. They couldn't manage their anger, and they got caught up in the road rage and the injustice of it all. But to show that this gets to be the extreme if we don't work with and understand things like our anger. It works unconsciously, and we can lose control in that particular way. I'm not saying we're going to commit road rage or murder, but the point is we can overreact with the anger when it's there. If it's not addressed, if we don't work with it specifically. So really what we want whenever we get triggered by a situation and there's fear is we really want to turn towards an authentic strength. We want to have the strength to meet whatever is happening. It's actually the appropriate response to whatever the triggering event is. So we have to learn how to approach anger. We have to be willing to have anger be present. We have to be willing to be a person who experiences anger. And so this is part of today is really each of us exploring what's our relationship, what's our how do we function with anger? Is it something that we're identified with? Is it something that we try to bury? We try to use bypass to get away from our anger? How does that work for you? For me, anger was probably one of the hardest emotions that I worked with in my path. And that was because in my birth family, anger wasn't allowed. My parents could be angry, but the kids couldn't be. And so if we got angry, we got punished. So I learned to turn off from anger. And my strategy as a very young child was to go to hate. And hate can come up in two versions. Usually there's the red hot, Hulk kind of hate, ripping doors and doing, violent things like that. And the other is the ice cold assassin. And that was my hatred, was I could be very cool and collect and really exhibit this anger. And my parents were of the generation that they used, physical punishment. And I learned when I was about 5 or 6 that if I went to hatred when they were punishing me, spanking me, it would completely unnerve them. And so I would, when they'd start spanking me, I would just look them in the eye and I wouldn't let out a sound. I wouldn't cry. I just would have this cold hatred. And it did unnerve them to where they stopped spanking me after a while. But this was a workaround that I did. And we all had these workarounds with different emotions or reactions. And so this is why working with anger and really opening to authentic strength is so terribly important. So the resistances to authentic strength, I've identified 3 resistances. One is identification with being weak, helpless, small, innocent, pure, that whole constellation. So it's we don't go to strength because we don't have strength. And we can feel this physically typically in our limbs, our arms and legs. It feels like ice water. So there's a kind of weakness in our system that shows up in a way where when the ice water is there, it'll feel like you can barely lift your arm, you can barely get up. So you can see what's happened is you're moving far away from strength. If you were feeling strength, you would have the ability to get up and do things and lift your arms, do all that. So, and we all have this structure, the innocent, pure, good one structure. And this is the one that we use for a variety of defenses, particularly uh, like I used to be a lawyer, and sometimes when I was early to court, I'd go in to the criminal court and just watch what they were doing. I didn't practice criminal law, so it was interesting. And I once saw a woman get sentenced to jail who had gotten completely frustrated with her 2-year-old, and so she had duct taped the 2-year-old to the wall. I mean, she hadn't really harmed him, but she had used duct tape and had him suspended on the wall for a period of time. And she was going to jail for some type of assault or parental neglect. And it was really interesting because after the judge sentenced her to whatever he gave her, her response was, "But I'm a good person." And I thought that was so interesting that here she had done this thing that many people would find objectionable, and she was going to jail for it, but her response was, "I'm good." And I really got to see the connection where no matter what people do, even people do horrendous things, there's a part of them that still sees themselves as being good. Yeah, I did that thing, but I'm a good person. So you can see how insidious this is built in and hardwired into our system. So again, with identifying these resistances and these different psychological qualities or states or identifications, we really can bring them out of unconsciousness so we can see them as they start functioning. And that's really the thing we want to do, is maintain awareness on our behavior and psychological state so that we can recognize when these certain psychological structures arise. The second resistance to authentic strength is rejecting of strength as being too aggressive. And I've worked with students on their anger issues, and some of them are avoidant because they don't trust what's going to happen if they get angry. They're worried about their temper, they're worried about their behavior, they're worried they're going to harm themselves or others. And typically, they're people who were exposed to folks who had that level of anger, had a violent temper, and they feel like this is the risk I run. So again, a rejection of strength, and it rejects, it makes anger a dangerous thing. So we want to just stay away from that whole constellation. And then another resistance is a fear of failure. So the idea that if I do show my strength, it's going to be insufficient. The other is going to overpower me or dismiss me. So I shouldn't bring it up. It's another form of the weakness, but I shouldn't go to the anger or express the anger because it might not be successful. And then what am I going to do if I've played my best card and it failed? I'm really going to be in trouble. So with the innocent good one and the hopeless, helpless, and weakness, there's actually a lot of power in that identity, because people will really remove themselves from their behavior and from the effect of their behavior more than the behavior. And if somebody were to get hurt by them, it would be like, well, I didn't intend that. I mean, I didn't intend for them to be hurt. But if we looked objectively at their behavior, most of us might agree that's a natural outcome from the way they behaved. But it allows a disidentification with doing things that harm people. And in fact, I talked to somebody recently who has a coworker who exhibits this, and it's somebody who can't take responsibility. If anything goes wrong or bad in their functioning at work, it's always not their fault. There's always a reason it's somebody else's fault. So this divorces them from accountability, but it also keeps them from being able to grow as an individual or mature as a personality, because they can't accept the fact that I harm other people. I've told the story that early in my career with one of my Zen masters, he was somebody who could be really brutal to the students. And we were very, very ignorant in the early days. I believed all my teachers were enlightened living Buddhas. So everything they did was enlightened behavior. So if anything happened where I was harmed, I viewed it as my problem and my issue, not theirs. And I remember complaining to my teacher, about something he had done that caused me a lot of suffering. And he said, I don't feel a thing. And my response was, well, if you're standing on my toes, you wouldn't. And he never really got it. I ended up, of course, leaving working with him. But the point is, that's how it can be with the disassociation. If you're someone that can't accept the fact that you can harm others, then it's really going to be hard to get in touch with authentic strength.